The moment I realized the message had been sent, my stomach twisted so sharply that I actually stopped walking in the middle of the subway platform. I stared at my phone, the screen glowing accusingly in my hand while commuters flowed around me like water around a rock. The message sat there in plain sight. If Adrian Cole gets any colder, I'm pretty sure he'll turn into a literal robot and start replacing us with spreadsheets. For a few seconds I could only blink at it, hoping I had somehow imagined the mistake. I quickly opened the contact at the top of the conversation thread, fully expecting to see Maya's name there. Instead, I saw a number I didn't recognize. A stranger. My heart sank as the reality settled in. I had just complained about my boss to someone I didn't know. I was about to type an apology when three small dots suddenly appeared on the screen, indicating that the other person was already replying. My grip tightened around the phone while I stood frozen beside the tiled wall of the station, listening to the rumble of a train arriving somewhere down the platform. The phone vibrated softly in my hand. A new message appeared. When I read it, a startled laugh slipped out of me before I could stop it. The stranger had written, "I feel obligated to defend robots here. We're not all that heartless." I covered my mouth quickly, glancing around to make sure no one was staring at me like I had lost my mind. The stress that had been sitting in my chest all evening loosened slightly as I looked back down at the screen. Another message appeared beneath the first one. Also, "Your boss sounds terrifying." I let out a slow breath and leaned my shoulder against the cool tiled wall behind me. Whoever this person was, he didn't seem angry about receiving a random complaint about a robot-like boss. That alone felt like a small miracle. Still, embarrassment quickly replaced the momentary amusement. I lowered my gaze to the keyboard and began typing an apology. My fingers moved quickly across the screen while people hurried past me toward the arriving train. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I wrote. That message was definitely meant for my best friend. For a few seconds nothing happened, and I wondered if the stranger had already decided the conversation wasn't worth continuing. Then the phone buzzed again. When I opened the message, I found myself smiling. I figured he had replied. If it had been intentional, that would have been extremely bold. The tension in my shoulders eased as I read the line again. The stranger clearly understood that the message had been an accident, and he seemed more amused than offended. I pushed away from the wall and began walking slowly toward the exit of the station while I typed another response. "Please ignore everything I said," I wrote, still feeling slightly mortified. The reply arrived almost immediately. The stranger wrote, "Ignore it. Absolutely not. I'm now deeply invested in this story about the terrifying robot boss." I laughed quietly to myself while climbing the stairs toward the street. The sound echoed faintly in the concrete stairwell, and a couple passing me glanced over with mild curiosity. It had been a long day, the kind that left my shoulders tight and my mind buzzing with unfinished tasks. The image of Adrian Cole's calm, unreadable face had followed me out of the office and into the subway like a shadow. Adrian didn't yell the way some bosses did. He didn't insult anyone or slam doors. Instead, he simply examined your work with an expression so neutral that it was impossible to tell whether he was disappointed or merely unimpressed. For some reason, that calm detachment felt even more intimidating. I stepped out onto the street and pulled my coat tighter around myself against the cool evening air. While walking toward my apartment building a few blocks away, I glanced down at my phone again. The stranger was still waiting for a response. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, I typed another message. "Trust me," I wrote, "you really don't want to be invested in this story. It mostly involves stress, deadlines, and a terrifying amount of spreadsheets. I slipped the phone back into my pocket as I reached the corner, expecting that the conversation would naturally end there. But before I had even crossed the street, the phone buzzed again. When I pulled it out, I saw his response. Now I'm even more curious. I shook my head with a faint smile while continuing down the sidewalk. Whoever this stranger was, he seemed determined to keep the conversation going. That realization made me hesitate for a moment. Normally, I wouldn't text with someone I didn't know. It felt strange, maybe even a little reckless. But the truth was that the light-hearted tone of the conversation had already lifted my mood more than anything else that day. Before I could overthink the situation, I typed another message. I feel like we should probably establish a rule before this gets weird, I wrote. I watched the screen as the typing indicator appeared again. The stranger replied, "I'm listening." I slowed my pace slightly as I thought about what I wanted to say. "No names," I wrote finally. "No photos. No personal details. Just two strangers complaining about life." There was a brief pause. Then his reply appeared. "An anonymous support group." I smiled as I walked past a row of dimly lit storefronts. Exactly. A moment later another message arrived. The stranger wrote, "Then I suppose introductions should follow the rule. You can call me R." I stared at the screen for a second. The name wasn't really a name at all, but somehow it fit the strange situation perfectly. While unlocking the door to my apartment building, I typed a response. "Nice to meet you, R," I wrote. "I'm still anonymous." His reply appeared almost instantly. "Fair enough." I slipped the phone into my pocket and climbed the stairs to my apartment, assuming that the conversation had probably reached its natural conclusion. At the time, I had no idea that this accidental message would become the beginning of a nightly routine. A week later, I was curled up on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees when my phone buzzed on the coffee table beside me. The sound made me glance up automatically. When I saw the sender, I felt an unexpected flicker of anticipation. It was R. I set my laptop aside and picked up the phone. His message appeared on the screen as soon as I unlocked it. He had written, "Did the robot boss survive today?" A quiet laugh escaped me while I leaned back against the couch cushions. The familiar joke instantly brought back the memory of the first message I had accidentally sent him. I typed a response. "Barely," I wrote. He rejected two campaign concepts and stared at the third one like it personally offended him. The reply arrived quickly. R asked what was wrong with the first two. His question made me pause for a moment. Most people didn't want to hear the details of someone else's work problems, but R always seemed strangely interested. I shifted slightly on the couch and typed back. "Apparently they were too colorful," I explained. "The client wants something more minimal and sophisticated." A few seconds passed. Then R responded with another question. "Minimal is usually stronger," he wrote. "Did you try clean typography?" I blinked at the screen, surprised by the suggestion. "Yes," I typed slowly. His next message appeared right away. "Muted color palette." I sat up straighter. "Okay," I wrote, a smile tugging at my lips. "Now I'm suspicious. Are you secretly a marketing psychic?" There was a brief pause before his response appeared. R simply wrote, "Just guessing." I chuckled softly and shook my head. "Well, your guesses are weirdly accurate," I replied. Another message appeared beneath my response. R asked, "Did your boss explain why he didn't like them?" The question immediately reminded me of the conversation that had happened earlier that afternoon in the office. I could still picture Adrian standing behind my desk, studying the design on my monitor with that same calm, unreadable expression. I typed out the memory. He said the concept was interesting but didn't match the client's visual identity. A moment later, R replied, "He might be right." I stared at the message, pretending to glare at the phone. "Wow," I typed back. I thought this was supposed to be a supportive anonymous support group. His reply came quickly. "I'm still supportive," he wrote. "I just think minimal typography might work better." I laughed quietly. "You sound suspiciously like him right now," I wrote. There was a brief pause before the next message appeared. R wrote, "Trust me, I'm definitely not your robot boss." Something about that answer made me smile again. It, the next morning, something unexpected happened at work. I had just settled into my chair and opened my email when my coworker Jamie leaned over the divider between our cubicles. She lowered her voice slightly as she spoke. "Did you see the update?" she asked. I turned toward her, confused by the question. "What update?" Jamie nodded toward my computer screen. "Check your email," she said. The campaign direction changed. Curious, I turned back to my monitor and opened the newest message in my inbox. As I read through the email, my eyebrows slowly lifted. Adrian had revised the creative direction for the campaign. The new approach emphasized minimal typography and a muted color palette. Jamie watched my reaction with a small grin. "Looks like your third concept might actually work now," she said. I nodded slowly, still staring at the screen. For a moment a strange thought flickered through my mind. The previous night's conversation with R echoed faintly in my memory. Minimal typography, muted colors. It was obviously just a coincidence. Still, the timing felt oddly specific. Later that afternoon, while I was adjusting the layout of the updated design, someone stopped beside my desk. I glanced up and immediately straightened in my chair. Adrian Cole stood there, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his dark suit jacket. For a moment he studied the design on my screen. Then he spoke in his usual calm voice. "This version is stronger." The comment surprised me enough that I turned fully toward him. "Really?" I had asked. Adrien nodded once, his gaze still on the monitor. "The typography is cleaner," he said. My mind flashed instantly to the conversation I had with R the previous night. I pushed the thought away and nodded politely. "Thank you," I said. Adrian's expression remained neutral, but his eyes lingered on the screen for another moment before he finally stepped back. "Continue refining the spacing," he added. With that he turned and walked away. I watched him disappear down the row of cubicles, feeling a faint ripple of confusion. That evening, when my phone buzzed with a new message from R, I told him about the strange change in the campaign direction. After reading my explanation, he responded with a teasing message. R wrote, "Careful, your robot boss might secretly be proud of you." I smiled while typing my response. That would require him having emotions. His reply appeared a few seconds later. "Even robots can surprise you." I laughed softly as I set the phone down beside me. But later that night, while lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I found myself replaying the day's events in my mind. The campaign direction had changed overnight. Adrian had unexpectedly complimented my work. And somehow, every time I talked to R about a problem at work, things seemed to improve the next day. I shook my head slightly at the thought. It was obviously coincidence. Still, as I reached for my phone to check the last message in the conversation, a strange question crossed my mind. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing slowly. "R," I wrote, "can I ask you something?" The typing indicator appeared almost immediately. Then his response arrived. "Of course." I hesitated before sending the question that had suddenly formed in my mind. "What exactly do you do for work?" For several seconds there was no reply. I watched the screen while the quiet of my apartment settled around me. Then the typing indicator appeared again, but instead of sending a message right away, it remained there for several long seconds before disappearing. The silence felt strangely heavy. And for the first time since our accidental conversation began, I found myself wondering why R suddenly seemed reluctant to answer. The wrong number, part 2, the typing indicator appeared again. Then it disappeared. I lay on my bed staring at the screen while the quiet of my apartment seemed to grow heavier around me. The glow from the phone illuminated the ceiling faintly as I waited for R's answer. When the phone finally buzzed, I picked it up quickly. His reply was short. "I work in management." I read the message twice. The answer felt oddly vague, especially considering how open most of our conversations had become over the past few weeks. Usually R had something thoughtful or teasing to add to almost everything I said, but this time the message sat there by itself, simple and careful. Still, it technically followed the rules we had created together. No personal details. No identifying information. I exhaled slowly and typed a response. "That sounds mysterious," I wrote. A moment later the typing indicator appeared again, and R replied, "It mostly involves solving problems other people create." I smiled faintly while reading the message. "That actually sounds a lot like my job," I wrote back. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that, but the brief hesitation before his answer stayed in the back of my mind. It wasn't suspicious exactly, just curious. Eh. The following weeks slipped into a routine that felt strangely comforting. During the day I focused on work, deadlines, and client revisions. Adrian Cole remained exactly the same as he had always been, calm, serious, and professionally distant. He spoke only when necessary, and his expressions were so controlled that it was almost impossible to guess what he was thinking. At night, however, my phone would buzz, and R would appear. Our conversations stretched longer as the days passed. Sometimes we talked about work, frustrations, but more often the topics drifted into personal territory. One evening I found myself sitting cross-legged on my couch while reading a message he had just sent. R had written, "What kind of music do you listen to when you're stressed?" The question made me smile. I rested my phone against my knee while typing my reply. "Bold acoustic stuff," I wrote. "It makes my brain quiet down." A moment later his response appeared. "That explains a lot." I tilted my head slightly while reading the message. "What does that mean?" I'd asked. His answer came quickly. R wrote, "You strike me as someone who thinks too much." I leaned back against the couch, letting out a small laugh. "You figured that out already?" I replied. Another message appeared. It was difficult. I rolled my eyes affectionately and typed back, "So what about you?" The typing indicator appeared again before his response arrived. "I usually listen to classical music while working," he wrote. That detail surprised me. "Oh, really?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "It helps me focus." I pictured him sitting somewhere quiet, maybe at a desk with headphones on, surrounded by papers or spreadsheets. The image was vague, but for some reason it made the anonymous figure behind the messages feel more real. Our conversation continued for nearly an hour that night. Eventually I found myself asking the question that had quietly grown in my mind over the past few weeks. I hesitated before typing, aware that it technically brushed against the rule we had set. Still, curiosity won. "Have you ever thought about meeting in person?" I wrote. The typing indicator appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Several seconds passed before his reply finally arrived. R wrote, "I think the anonymity is part of what makes these conversations work." I stared at the screen, feeling a small knot of disappointment tighten in my chest. I typed slowly. "You might be right," I admitted. A moment later his next message appeared. "Besides," he added, "we might ruin the mystery." I laughed softly despite the lingering disappointment. "You're probably right," I replied. But as I set my phone down later that night, I realized something that made my chest feel unexpectedly warm. Even without knowing his real name, I looked forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day. Eh, The strange coincidences at work continued. They were small things, subtle enough that I almost dismissed them each time they happened. One afternoon I mentioned to R that I was struggling with a presentation layout for a client meeting. He offered a simple suggestion about organizing the visual hierarchy more clearly. The next morning Adrian walked past my desk, glanced at the design on my monitor, and calmly suggested almost the exact same adjustment. Another time I told R that I was worried about speaking during an upcoming meeting. The following day Adrian unexpectedly asked me to explain my concept to the team, but when I hesitated, he quietly encouraged me to continue. "Your explanation is clear," he said evenly while standing at the head of the conference table. Though on, the moment caught me off guard. Adrian rarely offered encouragement to anyone. After the meeting ended, Jamie leaned toward me while gathering her notes. "Did Adrian just compliment you?" she whispered. I shrugged, still confused by the moment. "I think so," I said. Jamie raised her eyebrows. "Well," she replied with a grin, "you might be winning him over." That evening I told R about the meeting. After reading my message, he responded with a teasing comment. R wrote, "Your robot boss might secretly be rooting for you." I smiled while typing my response. "You give him too much credit." His next message appeared almost immediately. "Maybe you underestimate him." The words lingered in my mind longer than I expected. Eh, A month after the wrong number text, the office stayed unusually late. Our team had been working on a major campaign proposal, and the deadline was the following morning. By the time most of the employees finally left, the building had grown quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the air vents above the ceiling tiles. I stretched my arms above my head while leaning back in my chair. The digital clock on my computer screen read 9:47 p.m. My phone buzzed beside the keyboard. I glanced down and smiled automatically. It was R. Before opening the message, I stood up and carried the phone with me toward the break room. My eyes felt tired from staring at the monitor for hours, and I wanted a quick cup of coffee before finishing the last revisions. While waiting for the coffee machine to finish brewing, I unlocked the phone and read the message. R had written, "Did the robot boss survive today?" I laughed quietly while leaning against the counter. "Barely," I typed back. "The entire office is still here working." After sending the message, I set the phone down on the counter while pouring the coffee. A moment later, the screen lit up again. R had replied. He wrote, "You should go home soon. You've been working too hard." I picked up the phone again and typed quickly. "Just one more revision," I wrote. As I finished the coffee and returned to my desk, I noticed that my phone battery had dropped to 3%. I sighed quietly. The last thing I needed was for the phone to die in the middle of our conversation. After plugging the charger into the outlet beside my desk, I set the phone down and returned my attention to the computer. A few minutes later I stood up again to grab a printed document from the copy across the room. The office was nearly silent. As I walked back toward my desk, I noticed a figure standing beside it. Adrian Cole. He held my phone in his hand. For a second I simply stopped walking. My heart began to pound in my chest. Adrian looked up as he noticed me approaching. His expression remained composed, but there was something different in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. He held up the phone slightly. It lit up, he said calmly. I stepped closer, confused. "What?" I asked. Without saying anything else, Adrian turned the screen toward me. A message preview glowed at the top. I recognized the text immediately. R had written, "Did the robot boss survive today?" My brain seemed to freeze. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Adrian cleared his throat quietly while still holding the phone between us. "I assume," he said carefully, "this message was not intended for me to see." I stared at the screen, my mind racing through the implications. Then something clicked. Slowly, almost mechanically, I lifted my gaze from the phone to Adrian's face. "You are," I said. The words came out as more of a realization than a question. For a moment Adrian didn't respond. Then he exhaled softly and lowered the phone. "Yes," he admitted. The office seemed impossibly quiet. I felt my face grow warm as the past several weeks replayed in my mind like a rapidly unfolding puzzle. The advice about typography, the campaign changes, the encouragement during meetings. Every coincidence suddenly made perfect sense. "You were the wrong number," I said slowly. Adrian nodded once. "I was," he confirmed. I stared at him, waiting for anger to rise. Instead, an unexpected laugh escaped me. The absurdity of the situation was simply too much. Adrian looked slightly startled by my reaction. "You're not angry?" he asked. I shook my head while still laughing softly. "I spent weeks complaining about you to Yub," I said. A faint smile appeared on his face for the first time since I had known him. "I noticed," he replied. I crossed my arms while studying him. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. Adrian hesitated before answering. "At first," he explained, "I assumed the conversation would end after the first night." He paused briefly before continuing. "But it didn't." I tilted my head slightly. "And you never thought it might be awkward when I eventually found out?" I asked. His expression softened. "I thought about it often," he admitted. I considered his answer for a moment before asking the question that had been lingering in my mind. "So why keep talking?" I asked. Adrian looked down briefly before meeting my gaze again. "Because I enjoyed the conversations," he said simply. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I glanced at the phone still in his hand. "Well," I said slowly, "I guess the mystery is officially ruined." Adrian handed the phone back to me. "Perhaps," he replied. I studied him for a second before a new thought crossed my mind. "So," I said, raising an eyebrow, "now that the anonymity rule is broken, what happens next?" Adrian considered the question. Then, to my surprise, he spoke with a hint of awkwardness I had never heard from him before. "If you're willing," he said, "perhaps we could start over properly." I blinked. "What do you mean?" I asked. He adjusted his jacket slightly. "I know a coffee shop nearby," he said. "Tomorrow morning." A smile slowly spread across my face. "Are you asking me out?" I'd asked. Adrian looked faintly amused. "I believe I am." I slipped my phone into my pocket and nodded. "In that case," I said, "I suppose I should finally learn your real name." He extended his hand. "Adrian," he said. I shook it, smiling. "Lena,